Hey everyone, this is Chris with The Angelus Woodcraft, and I'd like to welcome you to my second YouTube video. Today I'm going to be making a chessboard, and this will actually be my first ever attempt. To get to the point and hopefully get you to stick around, I'm going to give you a quick preview summary. I'll be turning this into this. Okay, like with every one of my projects, my first step is to mill my lumber down. In case you're not familiar with the process of milling, you go ahead and run it over the jointer first. That gives you one flat face. Then you put it through the planer, and that gives you a parallel flat face on the other side. This is usually done with rough lumber, and I usually buy rough lumber because it's typically cheaper. And there we go, we have some walnut and some maple. And now I'm just going to make sure that all these pieces are the same thickness on their face by sending them through the planer. I'm getting ready for the first glue up here, and I actually used two larger pieces on the outside, with one of them being walnut and one of them being maple. The reason I'm doing that is so I can trim it down to size after all my glue ups are done and make sure those squares are at least as close to 1 5/8, that's my goal, as possible. And now before that first glue up, I'm jointing the pieces so I have a nice flat edge so that they all glue up nicely. And then I planed the other side so that I could keep everything the same width. As we move in the first glue up here, I want to take a moment to say I'm really proud of how far I've come in only a year. Now don't get me wrong, I had some basic woodworking experience from my past, building some random projects throughout the years, but none of these projects ever required a great deal of precision. But this past year has been filled with opportunities to increase my skill set and build up my shop. For example, I worked at a local rockler outlet for around 6 months, which made it way cheaper to buy tools using my employee discount. On top of that, I got to interact with woodworkers far more advanced than myself, which really helped me get any kind of niche questions answered without having to do a whole bunch of research. But that brings me to another point. I usually see comments in other videos saying, "Oh, look at your shop. Of course you're able to build that with all those tools." But that's the main point. If you want to get good at something, you need to be willing to invest time, energy, and most importantly, money. Now I realize that's often easier said than done, but I want to give myself and others credit for the time, energy, and money they've put into something they love. I've seen almost zero monetary return from what I'm doing here, but I feel confident that if I keep at it, it can amount to something. And that's enough to keep me going. Now, with all that said, I have a very simple ask. These videos may seem easy enough to put together, but in reality, they take a lot of time and effort. So if you would consider subscribing, liking, sharing, that's a big one, and or commenting on this video, it would greatly help me keep making content and opening my shop up to you all. It's a small act for you, but a huge gesture for me, the channel, and my business. So anyone who actually does that, I really appreciate it. Thank you. Now, let's hop right back into what I literally have labeled in the timeline as seasoning the wood. This is a technique that someone suggested to me on Reddit. Use a little bit of salt in between each glue seam, and this keeps the pattern in alignment. I was kind of worried that it would leave big gaps in my glue up, but it did not. And now I think I might use this on my cutting boards in the future. For best results, make sure to use the expensive pink Himalayan sea salt. Anyways, like in all of these glue ups, I wait about 24 hours before I take the glue off, and now I'm just cleaning this up really well because this is going to be the final face. So now I'm just trimming this board down. If you remember, I talked about those pieces being a little bit longer on the inside and outside, so this is just getting everything closer to that 1 5/8. And now I'm actually going to be using a piece of 1/2-inch Baltic birch ply. So I put in a plywood cutting blade. It's got a couple more teeth on it, so it's gonna just keep me from tearing out that veneer. So I cut this piece down to 13 inches. Then I cut that strip into 13 inches as well. So I have these 13 by 13 inch squares. So whether this was completely necessary or not, I'm not sure, but the idea is that I could counteract any sort of wood movement that might happen with these pieces of hardwood that are glued together. I mean, some of them are glued together on the end grain, and that's an inherently weak joint, even with glue. So this seemed like a pretty good way to mesh up those face grain pieces. If you have any experience with building chessboards, or even if you just have any ideas, please share them down in the comments below. Is this overkill? Is it actually making the situation worse? Let me know. Had to put some bricks down to raise this whole thing up so I could actually put my bar clamps on there. I'm a little short on clamps. So I once again let that dry overnight and came back the next day, took those clamps off, And now I'm just trimming off that excess plywood. Again, this is kind of, me figuring out the right order of operations when doing this. This whole step would have been a whole lot easier if I had just waited to trim the main board until after I had attached the plywood. But anyways, I just ended up throwing in this flush trim bit so that I could remove any of the plywood that I didn't get on the saw. I got pretty close, but there was still just a little bit of an overhang. And of course, you saw that right there. I wound up taking this big notch out, but thankfully it was only on the underside really. That you can see on the top, it actually looks pretty flat still. So I wound up coming back when I was attaching the frame, using some epoxy to fill that in. And then I set my jointer as light of a depth of cut as I could, and I ran those over. I was actually able to do the end grain without too much tear out. I would do the end grain if you have to do that first, and then come back and hit the long grain and clean it up. And then I ran them through the planer just to take down any high spots, because I know that when I was clamping those down, there were a couple spots where it bowed down. And there they are, the boards themselves. But we're not even close to being done. So now you see me getting started on the base, which will just be a simple panel glue up. So I'm zooming in here to show you those little white lines. You can't see them very well, but what you're going to want to do is turn them in on themselves. And then you can run it over the jointer. And in case your jointer is not perfectly square, this is a great technique to make sure those panels will match up perfectly. While those dry, I can go ahead and start getting ready for the framing pieces. I pulled out my larger crosscut sleds so I could set a larger stop block, and I cut those down to rough dimensions. And now I'm getting those pieces of brass out. This was pretty exciting. This was my first brass purchase. But these are 1/8 inch thick by 1/4 inch wide. And I'm just going to line them up on the frame pieces like this. So what I'm going to do is cut a little rabbet in there where they can fit in, and then epoxy them in. So I cut them all down to size, and then I actually used the brass material itself to set my flat top grind blade so I could cut out that little rabbet. And I guess I lost the footage on that, but all I did was, I think you can see that little groove here. You can see how the brass slides in nicely. Yeah, I think you get the idea. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead here as I actually wound up cutting out a pretty long segment of video. This is the massive clamps I tried using to get everything to neatly hold together, but basically there were a whole bunch of issues with how I epoxied the brass and walnut frame pieces, and I'll discuss those details as we continue. But on the bright side, I had a great excuse to get a new tool. So I picked up this rigid belt/spindle sander, and this was to solve one of the first problems I ran into, which was if I was going to sand the epoxy off of here, I would need something that could keep those pieces square, right? So as you sand with, say, a random orbital sander, you're more likely to bring down the edges, and then you get a piece that isn't square and it looks ugly, and I don't want that on my finished product. Okay, and now as the footage clearly shows, you see issue number 2. Sanding metal gets very hot, and almost all adhesives will fail at a certain temperature. I looked up the adhesive. I was using JB Weld 5-minute epoxy. I think it's only good up to like 250 degrees Fahrenheit. So of course, I was generating all this heat, and you see the brass just kept falling out. And right here, you even see one fly out. One of the ways that I dealt with, and you probably noticed I changed my sandpaper, is I got a coarser grit. This is 50. I might even have gone down more, but because I was using coarser grit, my thought process was that I would generate less heat, or I would at least remove material faster, so I would overall be spending less time on the belt and generating less heat. And this did work for 2 of the 8 that I epoxied. And that leads me to issue number 3. It's very likely that most of these failed due to poor adhesion in the first place. It's kind of funny to me how you can understand the concepts of something pretty well, and then it all goes out the window the moment that you try something new. All I mean by that is, it's pretty common knowledge that doing a light sanding before applying paint to something will provide better adhesion. But in this case, I did nothing to prepare the brass. And after some research, it was very apparent I should have at least done a little bit of sanding, and it also seems pretty common to clean your metal pieces down with acetone. So at the end of the day, I basically had to do all of those over again, 6 of the 8, which you were just seeing me do. After re-epoxying all those pieces and sanding them back down, I was able to finally take out my picture frame / miter sled and get to cutting the miters on those frame pieces. And after all that work, I was actually really excited to get down to doing this part. I was actually so excited that I completely ruined the work that I put into this piece and cut it backwards. So I went to go fix this, and the brass actually wound up coming off on the table saw this time. It shot back, kind of scared me a little bit, and you'll see here shortly that this winds up being a bit of a foreshadowing event. And here I'm just showing you the correct orientation. I also just want to take a moment to say, in general, this method of cutting metal was a little bit sketchy. Not only was there that fear that brass might come undone and shoot up at me, but I'm also getting these brass shavings kind of shot into my face. So I'm in general not feeling very confident about this process, and then this happened. Now, for someone who doesn't completely understand what's going on here, this probably doesn't seem that bad, but the sound of the blade is a key detail. What actually happened was the carbide tooth on this saw blade chipped off. And what's really scary about that is that carbide tooth could have wound up anywhere, and I'm really happy that didn't end up lodged in my neck. So I went inside, did a quick manual inspection, everything looks good. Thankfully, I'd only shat myself. With that being said, I actually do take my safety in the shop very seriously, and not just the safety glasses all the time. I do hearing protection, I try to wear a respirator as much as possible, especially if I know I'm going to be dealing with a whole lot of dust. But I actually did find a safer way to cut these, and it was simpler than I ever would have thought. All I had to do was turn them upside down so that if something did happen where the blade shot that back, it was actually going to shoot down and into the jig or table and not up and into my face or body. And another precaution that I took, and it might seem kind of counterintuitive, but I actually raised the blade up to a higher height, because if you look at the tooth angle of the blade, this will actually better hold the piece down as I make the cut instead of pushing it towards me. And yes, I do realize that in my quick aside on shop safety, I wasn't wearing a respirator or hearing protection. This is because I was making such quick cuts, and in this case, I wasn't too concerned. And to be honest, there are times I employ the hold my breath tactic of breathing protection. But the important thing is, when I know I'm going to be making a lot of cuts or working with particularly nasty materials, I do ensure I'm taking the proper precautions. I've seen people on the internet cutting down MDF or sanding down epoxy with absolutely no dust collection, and I'm honestly baffled by the amount of ignorance it takes to show this off and set such a terrible example for others. It's one thing to be occasionally lazy about protecting your lungs, but it's an entirely different thing to completely ignore all risk because you think you're smarter than everyone else. But hey, if that's you, by all means, continue eating your nails for breakfast and see where that gets you. Now, if you haven't noticed, I'm not using wood glue to attach these pieces to the actual board. I decided to use some of that 5-minute epoxy that I used before because there was metal involved. And I'm using some acetone here to clean off the metal bits, or really just the whole piece. You can use anything that is a good degreaser, but I'm using acetone because it dries so fast. And this is called a strap clamp. It's really great for picture frames, mitered boxes, really anything where you have those mitered corners coming together. And this is that little divot that was created by the router earlier. I just filled that in with epoxy. So I think it was only about 30 minutes later that I came back and took these clamps off. I just wanted to make sure that there was nice even clamping pressure. I didn't want just 2 clamps holding that all together. So I threw some more clamps on, and this is how we got here. So the next day I came back, took those clamps off, and got to work with some 60 grit to take off the excess epoxy. Really happy I wound up getting this little belt sander because it helps keep everything square on those kind of small edges and really makes that whole cleanup process a lot quicker. And I had a little crack here in the miter, so I just used a little CA glue and activator to fill that in. And then I could come back and just sand that back to flush. And that's the result. There's a little bit of discoloration between the epoxy and CA glue, but it's very unnoticeable. And then I used a chisel to clean up some of that epoxy that squeezed out through the bottom, but I wasn't really happy with how that cleaned up, so I actually set the saw blade at the same height as the base there, and that allowed me to actually clean up all of that material in there. The reason this was important to me is because I'm going to be attaching wings that will form a box and make this board a bit more three-dimensional. So I actually reset this up on my crosscut sled, but you can see I just bump that over against the blade and I can get a pretty good cut. And so that worked really well, but it also left a little bit of these underhangs, overcuts, whatever you want to call them. But a majority of this overcut was going to be covered up by the box, and where it's not, I can just sand that back down. So as we move into making the pieces for the box, I'm changing my blade. And this is a pretty important aspect to consider based on the types of cuts you're doing, rip versus crosscut, and the material you're cutting. And while I was editing this, I counted how many times I do a blade change, and this isn't even representative of how many times I actually change the blade. But this is blade change number 3 in the video. And if you're new to woodworking, I definitely recommend getting yourself at least a few different kinds of blades. But if you can only afford one right now, there are 2 types that you might consider getting. One option is a 50-tooth combination blade, and the other option would be a 40-tooth general purpose blade. Either one should be pretty great for any of the cuts that you do at the table saw, but for my research, a combination will be a little bit better at hardwood, and a general purpose will be a little bit better at plywood. So now I'm just getting the dimensions of the actual board itself so that I can cut these pieces down to size. The board itself is about 12 3/4 by 13 1/32, so it's not completely square, but it's not something that anyone would notice. And as I mentioned, this is the first time I'm ever building a chessboard, so some minor imperfections were to be expected. But that actually brings up a good point. A lot of what makes a first time project so difficult is not just learning how to do it, but the minor details that go into making a final product. Take for example what I'm doing here. I don't think these joints will be very weak, as there's actually a fair amount of glue surface area between the box supports, the board frame, and the plywood. But I still don't feel super confident it will stay together over time. But a few days after I had already completed this assembly and had it sanded, I actually came up with a solution that would be hidden and address any concerns that I had. All I did was put a few brad nails in where the box walls intersected with the plywood, and this should keep things nice and strong over time. Then I mixed together a little bit of wood glue and sawdust to fill the nail holes. Wood filler might have been a little bit easier to work with here because sanding down that wood glue was pretty tough. But let me get back to the point I was trying to make. In just about everything you do in life, there are easy versus hard ways and good versus better ways to do things. I would say the nail solution I used was a good way to address my concerns, but it's not the best or even better way to attach those pieces, as I had already attached everything together. So when dealing with the intricacies of learning something new, there are many ways to do something, but if it's not already available to you, you will find yourself at a crossroads where you either take the good option, or you have to stop your actual project waiting around to order, pick up, or teach yourself the better method. And so if you're anything like me, this can be really distracting and significantly delay finishing the actual project. But with all that said, don't let that get you down. The only way that you learn the better way is by first using the mediocre or good way, because that's all you have. And then you research and you figure out that there are better ways to do something. So if you're procrastinating trying something new because you're worried about doing something not the best way the first time, forget about it. You have to learn somehow, so get to it and learn from your mistakes as you go. Now, part of this build was to build a drawer box. I have made drawers before, but I wanted to make this one look really clean and use some different joinery that I knew would make this strong. So I decided to go with a rabbet joint. These were easy enough to make, but I did need to dial in a few things on the table saw and draw myself some reference lines. With all these measurements, I needed to make sure that I accounted for the actual thickness of the plywood, which was 1/2 inch, and I also needed to make sure I was considering the material being removed from the sides, so my front and rear pieces would come out to the correct dimensions. Because I was removing 1/4 inch on each of the sides, I needed to make sure that the front and rear pieces were actually 1/2 inch longer overall based on my sketch. So then I performed a dry fit just to make sure that everything was fitting together nicely, and for some reason, after giving you guys a whole lecture about changing out your saw blade, I didn't use my flat top grind ripping blade, and I needed to do a little bit of a cleanup on these with a chisel. And now that I've confirmed everything is fitting together nicely, I went ahead and made some lines and cut those down to size. And then I set up my table saw for the final rabbets of this drawer. They'll go on each side and they'll create a little recess where the base can drop into. So for the cleanup on those, I actually decided to try out my rabbiting block plane. I was thinking about selling this because it's not the best one ever, but for this it actually did a pretty good job, so I might have to keep it around. For assembling the box, I'm just going to use some glue and some 3/4 inch brads. The nails are less there for strength than they are to just hold everything together while the glue dries. There's a very thin veneer on this ply, so because I don't have a pin nailer, I actually ended up kind of tearing out those spots in the base a little bit, but it's not that big of a deal. That tear out was very minimal and it's out of sight anyways. There's also kind of an ugly gap right there, so I just put a little wood filler in it, and again, it's just something I'll have to live with on this one. So you might have heard me mention a flat top grind blade earlier. It's also referred to as FTG, but this blade has a flat tooth shape on top, and this allows me to get a nice clean spline, or really any time that I might be cutting a dado or a rabbit, this would have been the better blade to use. But anyways, I just used a piece of scrap to make sure that that brass was going to fit in there nicely, and it did. And here's another great example of the challenges that come with learning something new. Ideally, I would have cut these splines before I attached the box sides, but because I didn't, I was now dealing with this awkward assembly that I had to run over the table saw. And that's another key component to creating things. As I've progressed through my woodworking journey, I've come to realize that workflow is everything. I recently switched the CAD modeling software I use from SketchUp to Fusion 360. And while learning a new software is difficult on its own, learning an effective workflow is an equally important and sometimes more difficult task. In order to get a useful end model, there's much more at play than just creating a pretty 3D sketch. If you want to reference or change your model in the future, designing it in the proper order and using the proper software elements are very important to bringing that design into the real world. And in the real world, these same concepts carry the same value. But unfortunately, this can also become another distraction, keeping you from doing the work that needs to be done. My advice is similar here to as I discussed before. Instead of finding the best way to do something right away, learn and recognize when the workflow needs to be set aside in order to simply get the job done. I can guarantee you that with practice, repetition, and paying attention to which elements need to take priority, you will find what works best for you in the long run. Although making videos like this is a lot of work, I have found myself really enjoying it as it gives me a chance to reflect and review how I deal with, or already dealt with, roadblocks I came across during the build. And this isn't just something that I've found while I'm editing. When I'm recording, I often find myself taking a little more time to analyze what I need to do and the best way to do it. Whether that be because I have time to think while I'm moving the camera around, or because I'm afraid of being roasted in the comments by anonymous internet users. Either way, if it works, and I end up getting a better product as a result. Right here, I'm just putting an 1/8 inch roundover on the top and bottom of the board, and that will bring down the sharpness of those corners and overall makes the whole piece look more professional. A trick I picked up from Blacktail Studio is to actually wait until after you've sanded at 120 grit to do your roundovers. On top of that, I use a sanding pad from Rockler that is in the shape of an 1/8 inch roundover, and I use this at all grits past 120 to maintain this shape. I'm going to be using Rubio Monocoat as my finish, and that requires a very clean surface, so I'm using some mineral spirits to wipe everything down. However, this has added value beyond just prepping for the finish, as it reveals any dried glue spots I missed while sanding, or any other imperfections I may want to address before applying the finish. While that mineral spirits dries, I'm going to cut the frame pieces for the base. I was originally going to leave the base as that lone panel glue up I made earlier, but adding these frame pieces will give the top and bottom a uniform look, instead of having exposed end grain on the bottom only. And I'm just going to use wood glue to connect this all together, as there's no metal involved. But after doing this, I had a few concerns with the frame pieces that are glued directly to end grain. Next time, I plan to use dowels to mitigate this. So after that glue had dried, I went ahead and took those clamps off and followed the same procedure that I did for the top. And then I actually jumped ahead to putting on some finish. The reason I put finish on the top and base separately is because it was going to be easier to put finish on the inside of the box while it was disassembled. That space is quite small and I wasn't going to be able to fit my hands in there after I'd attached the base. And if you don't know, not finishing one side of a project is a good way to wind up with warping later in the piece's life. To attach the base to the top, I decided it would be a good idea to use dowels. Now, looking back, I would have liked to use this to attach everything together, but it was only later in the project I determined dowels would work best for this scenario. So I got myself a doweling jig kit on Amazon for around $25, and I must say, the value of this kit is definitely worth the money. I knew I was going to need some dowel alignment pegs for what I was doing, and this kit even had those, so it was an easy purchase. If you're looking to try using dowels for the first time, I would recommend grabbing this kit before even looking at any of the more expensive options. This is not sponsored, I'm too early in my YouTube career for that, but I will throw a link in the description for anyone wondering. So unfortunately this kit only came with 2 of each kind of the dowel alignment pegs, but that was alright, I figured out a way around that. All I had to do was make sure that everything was aligned on the first 2 when I pressed down the pegs, and then once I had the first 2 holes drilled, I put dowels in there and could reference that for the front 2 holes. Now, if you've liked what you've seen so far, consider checking out my Etsy as I plan to finish the other chessboard and put it up for sale there. If you want to keep tabs on this, consider giving me a follow on my Instagram in the description below, and I will post when that board is up on Etsy. Additionally, if you're thinking about a custom project, shoot me a message and we can discuss the details. And here's where putting finish on before the project has been assembled comes into play. When the top and bottom were dry fit together, I scratched a shallow line following where the base would meet the top. I then used these lines to mask off that portion so I could put finish on the base but leave the dry wood behind where glue would be holding the top and bottom together in the near future. If you didn't notice when I was finishing the top, I also tried to make sure that I didn't get much finish on the portions that I knew would be made in the base. And so after letting that finish cure overnight, then I actually masked the other portions because I didn't want to get glue all over my fresh finish. And this was the moment I had been waiting for this entire project. I had been stopped dead in my tracks for a number of different reasons leading up to this, but I finally get to attach the base and top, and I was truly so excited. While that glue dried, I moved on to finishing up the drawer box with this stuff called edge banding. This is a white birch edge banding and it will really make this birch plywood look a lot cleaner and more professional. It's usually quite easy to use and it's actually a real piece of wood, cut very thin with a heat activated glue on its back, hence why I'm using an iron to put it on. I'm actually not sure about live wood edge banding, but if you ever find yourself using the melamine variety, using some baking/wax paper is a great way to prevent it from burning. And now I'm just throwing on a little wipe-on polyurethane as a finish. So with the drawer box drying, I went back to the drawer face to drill a little hole for the brass knob that will go there. If you haven't noticed, even though I put finish on this piece only around a minute back in the video, this piece isn't finished yet. And that's because in editing, I usually end up putting clips in a slightly different order than how I actually performed them. But I do that to create a more coherent story than what may have actually happened. If you were actually in my shop with me, you'd see that the efficiency I give off in my videos is only but a pipe dream. Anyways, after the drawer face finish was dry and I got 3 or 4 coats of wipe-on poly on the drawer box, I can now attach the two. And this is easily done with some double-sided tape. Just drop the drawer box into its cavity, then align the face so everything fits nicely, And then I just throw a few 3/4 inch screws in the back of the drawer face and this baby's done. But before the board can officially be considered done, I need to go around and polish up all the rest of the brass. I did this by masking off every segment, sanding up through the grits, 220, 320, 600, and 1000, and then using a polishing compound for that final luster. I tried using some buffing compounds and a felt wheel on my rotary tool, but I kid you not, none of them worked anywhere near as well as this automotive scratch remover I just had on hand. Looking back, I suppose I'm not that surprised it works so well since it's essentially a polish, but I did find it pretty funny how I went through all the effort of getting these additional products only for them to kind of suck. And that being said, I actually went back and reworked all of these parts not once, but twice for a total of 3 times, as I was extremely unhappy with the results of my first try, but after the second try, I had picked up a metal polish I was hoping could make it look even better, which I'm not so sure I even noticed a difference. So this whole process was an experiment that resulted in a bunch more work for me, but just look at that mirror shine, and without further ado, the final product. And I know some of you are probably going to want to see this drawer, so here you go. I want to give an especially warm thank you to all who stuck around for the entire video. I know this one was kind of long and I cut out as much as I could, but if you did stick around, I'm hoping it's because you really liked what I created here. So if you'd consider subscribing to the channel, hitting that like button, or sharing this video with others you think might enjoy it, it would really mean a lot to me and encourage me to keep putting out content like this. Again, I thank you all for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.